Welcome into the Sunday side session. We have returned for another year of recapping Nebraska football on Sundays. I am Mike Schaefer of Husker 24/7. I'm very excited today. Today's guest on the program from Fox, Kevin Kugler, joins. Kevin, talking about Nebraska football. How rare is that for you?
Yeah, I haven't gotten to do it as often as I did for most of my adult life the last
I
couple of
know.
years. So because it'll be like a blast from the past, and I get to talk about a Nebraska game that by the fourth quarter we were trying to figure out who was in the game and what they were doing. I couldn't have joined you the last couple of years and really spent much time talking like that. So this will really be a blast from the past.
Yeah, yesterday was really capped off to me how different everything was when I was talking to a member of the sports information department up there, and I asked him how it kind of went for them, and it was Matt Smith. If you're familiar with Matt Smith,
Oh,
great
very
guy,
much.
does great work up there. He's been up there for a long time, and he goes, "It's kind of my personal nightmare. Nebraska has 151 players, and I'm putting together the roster." And, I had to make the font so small that people weren't going to be able to read it to get them all on there. So I started pulling a few guys off that I didn't think were going to play. And sure enough, Kenneth Williams, number 25, gets in there. The entire press box is looking around. He's like, not on the roster. You're trying to figure it out. So that's the kind of day that it was over there. The biggest complaint anyone could have is that the font could not be made small enough for a usable roster in the press box.
I will have to talk with Matt Smith about why we take the link off of the roster and we don't have Lincoln High's own Kenneth Williams on there when we need to have that opportunity. I mean, as a proud link, what are we doing here? I mean, we're just going to – there aren't a lot of links that are playing Division I college football. Let's make sure we can make it known when they get into the game, for crying out loud.
Yeah, no, I think that I'll be curious what the next home game roster kind of looks like, especially that northern Iowa game coming up here in a couple of weeks. Like maybe they're going to give us a 2-page one for the first time ever.
Well, it was interesting, Shafe, because yesterday I was in and out of the booth with Greg Sharp, the voice of the Huskers. I was there just to kind of, if needed, help out, and so I was watching Ben McLaughlin, his spotter, and of course one of the voices of Husker baseball, kind of go through in the fourth quarter. And, Greg we all have spotting boards when we do play-by-play, which are basically just cards and things in front of us, however we write them down, that show the rosters and bio information and all that stuff. And Ben has a whole sheet of paper next to him that he's having to write down names and numbers of guys that are in the game that you couldn't fit onto the board. That is a play-by-play guy's nightmare, just as well as a sports information person's. Like, I don't know. You're not going to go 8 deep when you're putting together your prep for a game. So you're just kind of hoping that you know anything about this guy when he shows up. Or you don't mention him. That's the dirty little secret about play-by-play. You just don't mention him other than his name because you know absolutely nothing else about him when it gets to a game like that.
Yeah, that has to be one of the major differences between the NFL, where you have that 53-man roster and you already know who the inactives are. And so you know what that looks like. There's not going to be a surprise. And then in college football, we're talking about 151 players over there.
Yeah, you're running Kenneth Williams out into a game at the end of the game, and you're like, oh, wow, okay. I didn't even know he went to Lincoln High. That's great news for him. That is the one major difference from a preparation standpoint between doing NFL games and college games is that it's just the sheer volume of players. I know who's playing. They can bring up 2 guys from the practice squad on Saturday. That's not really a huge adjustment, but you know these are the guys that are playing. These are the guys that are going to be in the game. But you know what? For Nebraska yesterday, as I sat and watched that, and I thought, man, this is one of the many things that Nebraska football has missed over the last several years. There have been so many missed opportunities for development in this program, whether it's missed opportunities for that extra month of bowl preparation where you get a lot of young guys in, and blowout games where you miss the opportunity to get these guys such valuable game reps and opportunities to screw up in front of a crowd. I think that was one of the most positive things that came out of the game yesterday is the ability to work so many people into game action, because there's going to be injuries, there's going to be depth challenges, but that's how you build that depth, and they haven't had the chance to do that the last few years. So that was huge, I thought, yesterday.
Yeah, and I know you're a big baseball guy, and one of the things we've been seeing in the majors is some of the top prospects get called up for like the second game of a doubleheader just to get the initial like, okay, now you've been in a major league stadium, now you know what it's like. Saturday for Nebraska, it's an opportunity to get a lot of their true freshmen. I mean, I was just watching the replay this morning on FS1, and there's Quinn Clark, there's Keelan Smith, there's a bunch of young guys getting those first snaps out of the way, getting in that stadium, getting to, you hear the cadence, you hear your quarterback. It's just a different environment when you're being thrown in there. And so you'd rather have it happen in a setting like Saturday than, if there's an injury and someone's getting thrown in out of necessity in the middle of a Big Ten game.
I think that was one of the most positive things of a long list that I know we'll go through in our conversation. But I thought that was one of the most positive things. And the first thing I thought of as I'm going through the roster in the third and fourth quarter, going, oh, there he is. Oh, that's cool. He's getting a chance. That was one of the biggest takeaways that I had from this is there just haven't been these opportunities. And look, development is one thing, but how about cohesiveness in a locker room? Everybody's contributing. Everybody's getting a chance to say, I played in the season opener. I was a part of a big runaway win for Nebraska football. I just think from the standpoint of developing, as Matt Rhule wants to do in this second year, I think yesterday was huge in so many aspects.
Absolutely. I want to congratulate us. I don't know that a lot of Nebraska podcasts could get 6 minutes and 30 seconds into a recap of Saturday's win against UTEP without yet mentioning Dylan Raiola. So I suppose we should probably get there. Kevin, it's been fascinating for me as someone who really covers the recruiting side of things. I have spent 3.5 years talking about Dylan Raiola, talking about the possibility of Nebraska and Dylan Raiola. I remember the first time watching him throw in Memorial Stadium during Friday Night Lights and thinking at that point, like as a sophomore, one, really well-built kid, two, throws a nice ball. To actually get to see this whole thing play out, to see him in that uniform, and then some of the throws. I mean, Michael Brunson and I talked about it yesterday. One of the best throws of the entire day was the sideline route where Isaiah Nair just couldn't quite pull it in. I mean, that was a high-level 45-yard drop in a bucket throw right on the end zone line. And you're thinking, man, Nair's probably going to regret letting that one get away. And then second quarter, Dylan Raiola throws a beautiful ball down the sidelines over two defenders. Nair's able to catch it, keep his balance. I mean, what kind of takeaways did you have of seeing Dylan Raiola for the first time? And were you at all surprised by what you saw on Saturday?
I wasn't surprised by the arm talent because you can see that in highlights. You can see that watching high school tape. You can see that in any of the stuff that we saw. And like you, I mean, the name Dylan Raiola has been on the lips of Husker fans we may have talked about Dylan Raiola already longer than Dylan Raiola will play at Nebraska. If he has the kind of career that you hope he does, he'd be a 3-and-out guy. We may have already spent more time talking about him in the run-up to being a Husker than he will actually be a Husker, and that's okay. That you'd love to see that if you're a Husker fan, that you've had that kind of a successful quarterback, because it's the most important position in football. Nobody debates that. Your seasons can be made or broken by the play you get from your quarterback position. And Nebraska, we saw it last year. The opening game of last year was broken by plays made at the quarterback position. And it kind of broke the season because we saw it again in Colorado. Turnovers, problems at the quarterback spot. And all of a sudden, Nebraska's 0-2, and you're thinking, oh, great, here we go again. This is a different feel when you have a big-time quarterback. What I loved watching yesterday, and I thought this was high level, and I give credit to his offensive line. I didn't know what to expect, and we caveat all this. So if you're yelling at your podcast right now, caveat all this, it was UTEP. So I know they're not good. But the offensive line, I thought, did a pretty solid job of giving him a pocket to work with and also giving him the time to go through his progressions. I really enjoyed watching him. And you could watch him go through his progressions point by point by point. And I mean, look, give Ben Scott in the middle of that offensive line a ton of credit. I think that's still just one of the most underrated pickups that Nebraska had. And I thought Ben Scott coming in with all that experience as a starter was huge when you had a young quarterback. And it showed up, I thought, yesterday in game one. But the ability for Dylan to be able to have a clean pocket to stand there, and they rolled him some and they moved him some. there's so much more they can do with him. I know you've seen it from his high school tape. We just saw the very tip of the iceberg, but I was impressed with his progressions. I was impressed with his poise, and I was impressed with his arm talent and his touch. There's a lot to like. It's just the difference that a big-time quarterback in the most important position makes for a football team, especially at the college level, because those guys are hard to find. And you can set yourself apart from so many programs if you've got that position taken care of.
Well, and I think it was a good reminder of just sort of the difference of what Nebraska's had at quarterback for so long. I mean, they've largely had to rely on a guy who, a dual threat quarterback who's going to beat you with his legs. I mean, that's what Heinrich Haarberg was. Ultimately, that was what Jeff Sims ended up being in the few games that he played. He was more effective as a runner against Minnesota and Colorado than he was throwing the ball. Adrian Martinez is having a nice sort of resurgence for his professional career, but he struggled throwing the ball a lot of the times. Part of that was what Nebraska had at wide receiver. So to see a quarterback who's just able to move the ball through the air and, like you said, work through his progressions, that's not always been a thing Nebraska's had through quarterbacks. I mean, you've had a lot of hot reads, key reads, and quick get the ball out. And to have a guy that's able to do that, and he's doing that as a true freshman, is just, remarkable. And I'm glad you mentioned the offensive line, because I think one of the things that allows Dylan Raiola to be able to play the way that he has is that Nebraska has a veteran setup everywhere sort of but that quarterback spot. I mean, the two receivers who came down with touchdowns, two transfer guys in Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nair are seniors that played a lot of football. Your offensive line has had starts all throughout their career. You have 4 starters that are seniors, and Justin Evans has played a lot of football for Nebraska as well. So you have this sort of nice mixture of, very, very high upside youth potential in Dylan Raiola, but he gets to do it with a veteran offense that can help put him in the right position and help him make the right decisions.
Yeah, I look at some of the bodies on that offensive line, and you can't look at that line without thinking Micah Mazuka is just a mountain of a man. I mean, he is a mammoth individual on that line, and there's pieces there. And look, if you and I had done this last year, that would not have been a sentence that would have been uttered by either of us, because there were not a lot of pieces there with that team. You wanted to see it happen, and I thought they squeezed quite a bit out of that group last year.
I agree.
This team has a lot more upside, a lot more piece. I said to somebody at halftime that it's a bowl team. I mean, I think you can, if you're a Husker fan right now, and again, I grew up in an era where if you just said, "Oh, this could be a bowl team," people would have looked at you like like you said, maybe the sun will rise today. Well, of course it's a bowl team, but we obviously are in a different era. This is a bowl team. Now it's just a matter of how many wins can you get to improve what bowl you might go to? Is this a December 31 New Year's Day bowl kind of a team? Or is it a Detroit the day after Christmas bowl team? There's a difference in bowl team. I don't think they're ready to make a run at the college football playoff.
I agree.
But I do think they are ready to be in the 8 to 9 win conversation again. And I think they have the talent and the ability to get better as the season goes along. And it starts with a quarterback. You mentioned the wide receivers. You love having 2 big-bodied guys who can work out there like we saw yesterday. I liked what I saw from the offensive line, admittedly in a small sample size. There's work to do there. And I'm anxious to see what that defensive line can do against what I thought was a very pedestrian Colorado offensive line on Thursday night when I watched them struggle with admittedly a good program in North Dakota State. I think Nebraska has I don't know, we'll talk about that later. I'm not trying to advance the program here, Schaefer, but I do think that's a pretty significant advantage for Nebraska in that game on Saturday against the Buffs.
Yeah, we will certainly dive into that. There's no doubt about it. I'm glad you said what you did about the wide receivers. One of my favorite sequences of the whole game is it's right before half. You've called a lot of football. You've seen this. Those are when quarterbacks, you can tell the difference-making guys are the ones that can get you that final score right before halftime, that back-breaking touchdown. And we don't see it a lot where you've got they ran that sequence perfectly. I mean, they got to the 10-second mark. You get the clock stop. You get the opportunity for one more shot at the end zone. He makes a throw where only his guy, Jamal Banks, is going to be able to make that catch. Jamal Banks goes up and high points a ball. I mean, you got to kind of go back 10 years to Quincy Enunwa for a receiver that kind of had the physical presence that can go up and get a ball like that and come down with it. And it felt so simple. And yet, that's that's a pretty difficult thing to pull off. And again, it's his first half of college football. So for Dylan to be able to do that, and I don't know if you heard Matt Rhule say this in the post game. He said it he said it after the game to the Fox broadcast. But one of the things he loved is that Dylan made a really nice check out of a call that could have gone poorly against the defense, and it helped set up the longest run of the game from Emmett Johnson. And so he's showing already that he's got an advanced ability to kind of see and read what's happening in front of him on defense. And so if that talent around him is as good as it looks against UTEP, if it can look that good against Colorado and then into Big Ten play, there's a lot of reason to be excited about what this team can accomplish in 2024.
That touchdown pass he threw to Banks to cap that 2-minute drill is one of the best throws you're going to see all year. I mean, that was a pinpoint throw. He put it right where it had to be.
He stepped into that, and you could tell he loved it when he threw it.
Oh, I mean, you knew it was going to be. It was the ball he wanted. All Banks had to do was catch it. I mean, that was you could see it perfectly as it developed. Sitting in the stadium, you're like, oh my gosh, he put it right where he wanted it. And look, we see this a lot. College football, a lot of NFL football. 2-minute drills are not always run that efficiently. And remember, it started with a sack. So it didn't exactly get off to a great start. It starts with a sack, then you get a run, then Nebraska takes a timeout, and then Nair catches that ball for 15 and gets the first down on 3rd and 12. So it looked like for a minute that this was going to be a 3 and out. I mean, there were several instances in this game where Nebraska teams over the last few years would have punted or turned it over. 3rd and 12 on a 2-minute drive. Nebraska's not doing much with that. How about the opening drive where Nebraska's like 2nd and 30 or whatever it was? I mean, there were several circumstances in that first half that I thought really underlined the difference between what Nebraska was and what Nebraska can be with Dylan Raiola and with an improved wide receiver room. And I'm glad you mentioned Enunwa because I had a couple. I'm sitting there. In fact, I wrote it down on the piece of paper I was writing on during the game, that it reminded me this wide receiver core, I think, is similar to the one with Enunwa about, what was it, 2013, 2014, 10 years ago, where you had some guys with speed, you had some guys with size, you had a mix in that room. And I think Nebraska's getting closer to that in that room again. And again, we haven't seen even the slightest depth of this playbook yet. There's a lot they're going to be able to do with Raiola. There's a lot they're going to be able to do with this wide receiver group. I think the tight ends will have a larger piece than what we saw yesterday as the season goes on. There's a lot to do, but just a really positive experience all the way around.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to jump over to the defensive side of the ball because they had some really sort of kind of moments that you want to see early in the season. They had the 3-play drive where UTEP scores, and it's like, okay, that did not look how this is supposed to look at all. And I know that there was some of the offseason was spent like, how good of offenses did they play? Did they really play that good of defense or just take advantage of a schedule last year? How good are these guys going to be? And yes, it is UTEP, so you don't want to make too much of it. After that 3-play drive, UTEP didn't have another drive again of more than, I think, 28 yards the rest of the game. Nebraska's defense, regardless of whether it was the starters, the backups, the 3rd string, and even some 4th string guys that got in at the end, they made plays. It was like Tony White called them all together after that and was like, that is not happening again. And it didn't. And you didn't see any breakdowns. You saw them rallying to the ball, which was one of the sort of the stark contrasts of the 2023 season relative to what we had seen before. Usually it felt like a lot of times Nebraska was just getting beat in space. You'd have one guy who'd have to make a tackle. He wouldn't be able to. Last year, we saw a lot of group tackling. That was full on display on Saturday. I mean, you would see Mekhi Bayer would be leading a charge of like 5 black shirts to whichever UTEP minor had the ball. And that was really good to see. And they were flying around. And the crazy thing is, for as much as we spent talking about Isaac Gifford last year and Nebraska's secondary, they didn't have to do as much because they just kept everything in front of them outside of that one drive. I mean, it was a really nice show for Nebraska's second level, and of course, what they have up front. What do you think of the defense?
I saw this earlier today from our dear friend John Bishop, and he posted this, and I wrote it down because I thought that's pretty remarkable. he's through 13 games. And again, it's a small-ish sample size, but it's not really that small compared to the Riley era or the Frost era. Tony White's defense has yet to have a game where the opponent averaged more than 6 yards per play, which
wow.
In college football, 6 yards per play, that'll happen pretty regularly. UTEP's was 4.1 yards per play overall pass rush combined. And to compare, there were 17 games in the Frost era. There were 16 games in the 38-game Riley era in which you had 6 yards per play. And Nebraska in those two eras combined was 7 and 26 in those games.
Yeah.
So when you give up 6 yards per play, you lose way more than you win. That makes a lot of sense. And Tony White's defense has yet to allow a game with 6 yards per play. Now, it could happen this year. There's a couple of pretty good offenses that Nebraska will face. And next week could be one of those games. So that's a potent offense that Nebraska is going to face. It'll be a big test. I wrote down Mekhi Bayer's name a lot yesterday. I felt like I saw him all over the field.
Yep.
And I really was impressed with his mobility. I was impressed with his ability to get to the football. I thought he was very active yesterday. I like this front. I think the front has some depth to it. And that's not a surprise. I think when we came into the season, we looked at that front as a real strength for this Nebraska defense. And I don't think it disappointed in any way yesterday. They were able to hold their own. And again, it's UTEP. I'm anxious to see what they're going to do against some of the better teams. But it's a great place to start. If you can be strong in those lines, and this is the oldest adage in football, if you're strong in the lines, you're going to be strong on the field. And I thought their front was really good yesterday. I walked away from that with a very good feeling about the Nebraska defense. And again, that was the strength last year. I think they'll be the strength again, but now they have a quarterback that can help them out. And I think a good quarterback not only helps your offense, I think it helps your defense. It helps you stay off the field if you're a defense because your quarterback is able to convert on 2nd and 30 and eventually cash in for a first down. 3rd and 12 doesn't mean the end of a drive and a quick 3 and out all the time when you have a quarterback who's capable of pulling you out of some of those jams. So Raiola's impact is felt on more than just the offense. And I think you'll see it as the season goes along, how much he helps the defense too. A defense that has parts and is going to be allowed the opportunity for those parts to grow as the season goes on.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that we have gotten so used to over here that when a player kind of has his big moment and he arrives at Nebraska, you didn't see a lot of forward development. They kind of when they got to their top, they sort of were who they were for a couple seasons. What's nice right now is I feel like we're seeing the best version of Ty Robinson we've seen. We're seeing the best version of Nash Hutmaker, and I think that getting that extra year out of those guys and getting them to be able to play in this Tony White defense again, we're going to see a little bit more of where that development comes from, what Corey Campbell and the strength and conditioning staff can do to get those bodies right. And now, instead of just sort of playing a base defense, they can do some different things. And kind of what I'm working up to here, there was, I don't know how much you noticed him yesterday. I thought sort of like Mekhi Bayer, I just kept saying, oh, wow, there's MJ Sherman. I thought MJ Sherman had a really good game. And that was a guy last year who transferred in from Georgia. He's been involved at the highest level of college football, on the roster over there for a team playing for national championships. He's seen what good football looks like. Last year, I thought he was a nice complementary piece. I didn't think he was a standout player. I just thought like that's a nice depth piece that you have. This year, and maybe it's just one game, but if you're adding MJ Sherman opposite of Jamari Butler and you have Ty Robinson and Nash Hutmaker in the middle of those two guys on 2nd and 3rd down, life is getting a lot harder for the quarterback. And oh, by the way, sitting on the sidelines getting fresh is Prince Uman Mielen and Cam Lenhart and James Williams and Riley Van Poppel and Elijah Judy. The depth that they have up front is going to be a problem for teams the rest of the season. I mean, when we talk about Nebraska's strength being on that defensive line, part of it is that there's not a whole lot of drop off when that first unit comes out and the next unit comes in. So for MJ Sherman to really sort of look the way that he did yesterday, I hope that's not just like a one game thing, because that makes Nebraska even deeper up front.
I'm glad you mentioned Van Poppel because I was very excited to see him in the game yesterday. I thought it was kind of cool that he got that much time, and I think he's really there's a ton of upside with him.
Agreed.
And I think you can argue that jack position for Nebraska is one of the deeper developing positions on this team. It's untested depth in some areas, but I really think that jack position with MJ Sherman at the top of it has the potential to be one of the biggest strengths at the end of the season of this Nebraska defense. There's talent there, man. And I know you cover a lot of this talent as they're coming up, Schaefer. To see it all start to be utilized in the right spots and in the right positions, and to have that development start. I have told people since he came in, I thought Matt Rhule was the best PR coach Nebraska's ever had.
No question.
Beyond Devaney, beyond Osborne, in an era in which PR is such a big part of this thing. I don't think there's ever been a better PR coach at Nebraska. And one of those areas is he uses PR, I think, to light fires under certain players, to spark certain players. I thought he did it with Dante Dowdell in the spring. I thought he's done it with other players to kind of bring them up in the media and use the media to kind of make his point to a player like, hey, they're talking about the fact that you're the fourth team running back. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. They're the ones bringing it up, even though you've brought it up and kind of planted that seed. Not to mention all the stuff he's done outside football, in the state, reaching out to high schools, everything he's done. The only thing missing was winning games. And it's year 2, which in every year Matt Rhule's had a year 2. He's had a huge step forward, and I think we're going to see that again. But the coaching combined with the PR stuff, it's going to be a fun ride in the Rhule era. I don't think it's going to be the same sadness that we see at the end of year 4 in so many of these other eras.
Yeah, there's a lot of hope for that. There's a lot of hope for that. There's also a lot of football left, and so that's always
it's UTEP. I know We're selling sunshine and lollipops here, but I mean, look, even the special teams had things to talk about.
I know that's where I wanted to go. I went into the season, and I'm someone who's very high on what I think Nebraska will end up doing this year. I ended up predicting 9-3. I was 8-4 in the spring, and then gave an extra game because I talked myself into it.
Yep.
But the biggest concern I had coming in was special teams, and it did not get helped out by the fact that the Tristan Alvano status was what it was throughout fall camp. But it was beyond that. It just felt like last year they gave away so much field position. They couldn't return punts. Their kick return decision making was generally porous. Brian Buschini was inconsistent throughout. And then yesterday, other than that opening kickoff, which kind of felt like, oh, there's a shoe. Nebraska scores this, beautiful touchdown drive, overcome a 2nd and 30. Things are feeling positive. And then the special teams has to make a play and the ball goes out of bounds immediately. And you're thinking, okay, yeah, that's the third phase just showing its head right away. After that, pretty smooth sailing the rest of the day. You made your field goal. You had 2 nice punts. You had half of last year's total punt return yardage accumulated already by Isaiah Garcia Castaneda. Nebraska fans didn't even know you were allowed to run for 8 yards after you catch a punt. And it happened multiple times yesterday.
I mean, it's been 20 years since Santino Panico was charged with just fielding punts and not allowed to move the football. And I think there was an entire generation of Husker fans who may have thought that was the only thing you could do with a punt is field it and either go backwards or maybe fall forward for 3 or 4 yards. To be able to see punt return yardage stack up yesterday, guys aggressively going out to try to return a punt. Buschini averaging over 48 yards per punt in his limited sample size. I'm with you. I have been on this special teams harping thing forever because I think that has been such a neglected part of Nebraska football to the detriment of this program. And to see it go out of bounds on that first kickoff, I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. I mean, again with this. But that was the anomaly as opposed to the norm, which I was excited to see. I mean, again, it's one game, but there weren't a lot of one-game moments where you'd say, "Oh, special teams looks better," because that was just not a conversation you had the last, even for one game last year. You just didn't go, "Oh, special teams is shape." No, special teams bad, all the time bad. They were not bad yesterday, and that not bad is an improvement over what they've been.
Yeah, and you don't need it to be Virginia Tech and and Frank Beamer getting all the block punts and the best special teams in the world. But what you need, and especially in the Big Ten, where seemingly everyone else is very, very good at the third phase, you just need it not hurt you. And that's what it was yesterday. It was a helping hand, if you would. And
it cannot be a liability. And too many times over the last several years, it has been a liability that has hurt Nebraska in critical moments. And it didn't hurt Nebraska in critical moments. Although when that kickoff went out of bounds, the first thought was, oh, what are they going to do? If they do this against Colorado or they do this against Big Ten opponents, they're going to have problems with it. But it didn't happen again. And so you chalk it up to, all right, that happened. You move on, and hopefully you've learned from that opportunity. And they did. They were better throughout the course of the day. And that was, again, you just don't be a liability. That's the only thing you need not to be. You don't. Nobody's got to asking you to return every kick or punt for a touchdown. Just don't lose yardage. Don't lose the football. Don't be a liability.
Let's talk Colorado.
Yep.
I know you want to. I know I want to. It's been hard to not completely ignore UTEP, but largely that game coming up on Saturday has been maybe the most talked about thing all summer when focusing on Nebraska's schedule and their opponents. 6:30 kick should be a very, very festive atmosphere. I was asking Gary Sharp when I saw him come into the stadium on Saturday. I asked him how the tailgate lots were because I know what he was doing before the game. And,
rightfully so.
Yeah, he goes, it was a little subdued, and Chris Schmidt was right next to him. He goes, yeah, they're saving their strength for next week. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I think next Saturday's atmosphere in Memorial Stadium has a chance to be really, really special. I'm assuming you watched Colorado versus North Dakota State on Thursday. I will say this. Regardless of how you might feel about, not you specifically, Kevin, but how anyone might feel about Deion Sanders, I have found myself watching several Colorado games and just being transfixed by how endlessly entertaining they are through a variety of reasons. And that game on Thursday was no exception. That was an excellent way to kind of kick off college football because you got to see a little bit of everything. Some questionable coaching decisions, massive plays. Travis Hunter catching that touchdown while being like nearly in a chokehold. The talent that he has is so immense. So what I want to start with is this. I mean, when you watch Colorado play, what just jumps out to you just about that team just off of Thursday's game alone?
Well, the first thing is the same thing that jumps out to everybody. They have first-round talent at quarterback. They have first-round talent at wide receiver / corner in Hunter. Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter are first round, and with a quarterback class that's right now not necessarily great next year in the NFL.
I think he's the best quarterback in college football. I really do.
I think he's the number one quarterback off the board. So the first thing that stands out, and Nebraska fans, I think, know this is the best duo talent-wise that Nebraska is going to see this year. I don't care who they play the rest of the year. You're not going to see a combo of Sanders and Hunter that is any better anywhere else. This is a first-round draft pick quarterback and a first-round draft pick player wherever he decides to play in the NFL, whether they put him at wide receiver, which I think they should, whether they put him at corner, whether he tries to do both. Those two are immense talents. And regardless of what happens on Saturday, Sanders is going to throw for yards. Hunter is going to catch passes. There's going to be a lot going on. There's talent on that team. I don't know how good they are on the lines, and I think that's where Nebraska has the chance to exploit this team right away. I really think between Hutmaker and Robinson and the depth up front for Nebraska, that is a giant advantage for the Huskers to start this game. I think that's going to be a real challenge for Sanders to try to have enough time to do what he needs to do back there, because I think those guys are really going to push the pocket. So that's the first thing I look at in this, is that Nebraska's defensive line against that offensive line that I didn't think looked very good against the North Dakota State line that's not as deep or as big. So I'm anxious to see that matchup. I think that's going to tell a major tale. Nebraska's just got to remember that what they were doing last year for a while was working. And they have better talent now to make their game plan work. I think Nebraska is in a good position for this game, with it being at home, with it being at night, with a little more confidence and more talent. They don't have Shedeur Sanders. They don't have Travis Hunter. But I do think they have more talent in places like the Lions where I think it's going to matter. I think they have options at wide receiver that Colorado doesn't necessarily have from a depth at wide receiver standpoint. I think it's going to be a really entertaining game because most of the games Colorado plays, like you said, are entertaining. I like Nebraska's chances in this if the moment doesn't get too big for all these new Huskers. And that's the one thing that I don't know. UTEP was the opener, but this is the first huge hype game. A lot of these guys are going to have the chance to play in. And believe me, it's going to get a ton of hype, certainly locally. And I think nationally, this game is going to gain some steam as the week goes on.
No doubt about it. This feels like such a stupid question, but I feel compelled I have to ask it. For as good as Colorado is physically in the way that they can challenge you with Shedeur Sanders and Hunter and Jimmy Horn, who is a very good receiver in his own right, is the biggest challenge for Nebraska next week mentally, not letting the doubt and if something goes wrong early in that game, not letting it fester, not letting it beat you multiple times, because it feels like in recent years, Nebraska's largest opponent sometimes is on its own sideline, not the one across from them.
I think mentally from that standpoint, Schaefer, and I think mentally from what Colorado will try to do to them from a head game standpoint. Colorado has no problem trying to get inside your brain a little bit and force you to do something stupid, make a stupid mistake, get off schedule, get off your key, get off whatever you have to, or make a stupid late hit, make a penalty, do something that you shouldn't do that's off schedule for you from a team standpoint. They'll get in there like a grain of sand in an oyster, and they'll try to turn it into a pearl, and they're just going to irritate. And I think Nebraska needs to understand that that's what they're going to face. You saw it on Thursday night against North Dakota State. Nudges out of bounds, late hits, trying to get things fired up for their team and trying to get North Dakota State to do something stupid that's going to cost them. And North Dakota State did a pretty good job, I thought, of not falling into that trap. Nebraska's got to be careful to do that. I don't think you're going to see that from a guy like Dylan Raiola. I think he's savvy enough to understand the situation. And I think Nebraska's got enough experienced players to not fall into that trap, but it only takes one. You got to be careful not to get into that trap. I do think for Nebraska, that run game is going to be important. Can they establish it? Can they keep Colorado on the sidelines from an offensive standpoint? Who's the guy that carries the ball for Nebraska? Can you get Dowdell on track? Because I thought he looked the best of the running backs before the fumble yesterday. I'm anxious to see it. I think Matt Rhule and his game plan are going to be really important in this, but the mental aspect, and I'm sure they're going to preach it all week long of, take care of your own business. Don't worry about them right now.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the running backs. We hadn't really talked about them yet. I am curious because I thought Dowdell looked the best too. I'm curious if after the fumble, obviously he goes to the bench. They've talked a lot about that this year, that, if you make that kind of mistake, we have the depth that we can sort of move on from you.
Right.
I am curious if they're using that as a big learning experience and then going to get him out early in that Colorado game, get him that first carry, because I think his ability to kind of be a hammer and maybe where Colorado is softest on defense could line up pretty well for Nebraska.
Yeah, I kind of like a big back against that defense, and I know others like my good friend Damon Benning, who's not always the biggest fan of big running backs. I don't know that he would agree with that from a big running back standpoint, but I like having a big back against a team like Colorado, and I thought Dowdell's ability to make guys miss at his size on Saturday was pretty impressive. I liked his straightforward run, but I liked his ability to make a guy miss in the hole. He had short area quickness that I thought was a little bit better than I expected to see from him, especially considering he was one of those guys that I thought Matt Rhule was using the media pretty well to motivate going into the fall, and I think it worked. Now the question is going to be: was a fumble after a 12-yard gain? By the way, was a fumble in that situation a one-off, or is this a problem? Because if it is a problem, you're not going to see it play. They cannot afford to have turnovers. Right. They don't have that kind of depth to overcome all the turnovers that we saw last year. You cannot do that. But I thought he was the best looking running back, and I hope it was just a one-off situation because in that group, he brings something different than the other three, Ramir, Emmett, and Gabe Ervin, who's apparently the goal line guy. He brings something different than the rest of those backs. And I think that different aspect of things really would play well against Colorado this weekend.
Yeah. One of those guys, you talked about Matt Rhule using the media with Dante Dowdell. One of those guys that he did that last year with, and it was a big success story. Tommy Hill.
Yep.
Didn't see him a lot yesterday because they didn't attempt a single pass to his receiver, to his responsibility. Is it too obvious to say that Tommy Hill is one of Nebraska's X factors for Saturday? How he potentially matches up?
Yeah, I think he's certainly going to be the guy that they pay attention to. And I got to assume that Tommy Hill is going to have a charge with Travis Hunter a good portion of the day. I mean, you'd be crazy not to put him on the best receiver right now. If you are interested in matching that guy and having him follow Travis Hunter around, then Tommy Hill is the guy to do that. But you're right. That was a great example of Matt. In fact, maybe the first example of Matt Rhule doing that in his tenure at Nebraska was last year with Tommy Hill, and it worked to perfection. And I think he plays a huge role. I don't even know if I'd call him an X factor, Schaefer. I think he's just a major factor in what Nebraska needs to do to slow down not only Hunter, but as you mentioned, Horn. I mean, those are two talented wide receivers that Colorado's going to run out there on Saturday.
So when you get in season, because you do a lot of, you're one of the lead broadcasters for Fox, where will you be watching the game on Saturday? Will you be able to watch the game in its entirety, or do you have obligations the night before the NFL opener?
We will. So usual schedule is on Saturday night, we have a production meeting right around 6. So that'll be Eastern time because we're in Tampa. We have Washington, Tampa to start the season. Jaden Daniels' debut is our game. And so we'll have a production meeting at about 6. It'll last an hour and a half, hopefully done around 7:30 Eastern when this game is about ready to kick off. And then I'll head back to my hotel room and watch football. I mean, that Saturdays are great because we do our meetings with teams. On Thursday, we meet with the road team. And on Friday, we go to practice. And then we sit down with the home team on Fridays and chat quarterbacks and coaches and all that other stuff. But then Saturday's a work day. So Saturday, I'll spend the day making sure everything's finalized with what I need, getting my notes all situated. Football will be on all day. We'll have our production meeting, and then I'll watch football that night. And we have the late game next week because it's not till 4:25 Eastern. So I can stay up late watching football and still be ready to go for our game on Sunday afternoon.
I have heard you call like every sport under the sun, over the radio or seen you broadcast on TV. Is football king for Kevin Kugler too, or is this the start of the best time of year for you?
I love football. I mean, Schaefer, we all grew up, in the football place. So it's hard not to think of football as the number one. I've probably called more basketball than any sport that I've done. But this is a great time of year. It is a great time of year when you're going in and the weather's still great. You're going into a stadium, you're watching football, you're getting the chance to talk football with coaches and players and learn stuff from my analyst, learn stuff from a coach. That's my favorite part of it still, is going in to learn something. Like I mentioned, we have Washington, Tampa. I'm so excited this week to talk to Dan Quinn about the process of rebuilding a franchise, because that's what they're doing from really the owner on down in Washington. Yeah. And I think it's similar to what Matt Rhule's had to do at Nebraska. So there's always things you can glean from an NFL level that translates to things you care about elsewhere. And so I'm anxious to have those conversations with him, because I think it's similar to what Matt Rhule has had to do. He brought his NFL experience, coupled it with his college experience, and knew he had work to do because he came into a situation that was not great and is having he didn't tear it down to the studs like they're doing in Washington, but he did a lot of remodeling work. There was a lot of drywall needed in Lincoln, and there still is, and there's plenty of it needed down in Washington too.
Well, I'm sure you crossed paths with Matt Rhule with your Fox duties. When he was initially announced, or when you became aware that he was kind of the favorite for that job, did you see it? At that time, if you can go back to November of 2022 in your brain, did you see that as a good fit for Lincoln, Nebraska? Because you know intimately well what Lincoln, Nebraska is and the fishbowl that it can be for coaches. But you also had good experience with Matt Rhule when he was with the Carolina Panthers to know kind of what his personality was at that point.
We had several games of Matt's when he was in Carolina, and so we had several chances to talk to him. The problem was, for most of the time I was around Matt Rhule in his Carolina days, there was COVID days, so everything was on Zoom. We didn't really have a lot of in-person meetings, which I would have enjoyed. He was always really good in our Zoom meetings. Though the one question I always had was, and I have this with a lot of coaches who I think are best suited for college, and Nick Saban being paramount among them. And so this is not a disparaging statement in any way, shape, or form. Nick Saban was a better college coach than he was an NFL coach. And I think Matt Rhule is the same way. I think a lot of Matt Rhule's personality is so suited for the college game that I don't know how often or how successful, especially when you were the franchise that was struggling to find its way in Carolina. I don't know how often players respond to that the same way that they do at the college level. And look, let's be honest, you hold a bigger hammer at the college level. You are able to control playing time so much more. You bench a guy in the NFL level, then it gets out. There's media, there's PR, there's all this other stuff that really takes on a life of its own. In college, look, Dante Dowdell fumbled. We didn't see much of him the rest of the day. And right. That happens in the NFL, and it's all the conversation, and he's got his agent calling you, and he's got this, and he's got that. And maybe we're getting to that point in college football where the representative calls about the NIL. I don't know. But but from the standpoint of Matt Rhule's personality, I've always thought his personality was a personality that was perfectly suited for the college game. And I'm telling you, the way he has embraced Nebraska is, I think, the perfect blueprint after so many years of people trying to figure out how to marry, and I think this has always been the challenge, how to marry the tradition, the past, the insistence that we pay homage to that with the notion that Nebraska can't be that anymore. And I think he's done such an amazing job of involving Coach Osborne, paying homage to the great man that he is and the great coach that he was, but not being tethered to that era. And I mean, it's little things like, you don't call them I-backs anymore. They're running backs. You don't have to be that program anymore. But he's been able to do it, building it in a way that I think Coach Osborne would have appreciated when he was coaching, because he's reached out to high schools. He's done the job he's supposed to do. He's done due diligence with the state. He's embraced being a Nebraskan. All of that stuff is such a collegiate thing. And I always thought, even when he was with the Panthers, that his eventual path would probably take him back to college. And look, I think he's great for the college game. And I hope, from a selfish standpoint, as somebody who still lives in Nebraska and knows what it would mean to this state to have Nebraska be good again, I hope he succeeds. And I hope he succeeds wildly in doing what he's trying to do in Lincoln, because I know how much it means to everybody here.
Absolutely. Kevin, appreciate your time here on a Sunday morning. I know that this was the only week of the year where it was going to be a possibility. So for you to donate that time to us here at Husker 24/7, greatly appreciated.
No, it's my pleasure, Schaefer. And you know what? We did 48 minutes without mentioning the 2016 World Series. I thought that was really good of us. And I went
very magnanimous of you.
I went non-Cub hat for you today. I thought about it. I was like, I could wear a Cub hat, but why? Why would I do that? I didn't want to do that. So, there we go. We part as great friends without mentioning Game 7 of the 2016 World Series, the greatest baseball game ever played.
Yeah, I mean, it was... as someone told me the other day, because somehow this comes up even in 2024. Well, hey, at least it was entertaining. Yeah, it was entertaining. I'll always have that forever. It was entertaining. No, seriously, Kevin, appreciate it.
Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. Kevin Kugler of Fox, you can catch his stuff. I mean, during football season, you'll see him every Sunday. Busy, new broadcast partner this year, right?
Yeah,
Daryl Johnson.
The Tom Brady shuffle. We saw a lot of changes in our crews this year. So I'm with Moose, though. I'm excited. Daryl's been doing this a long time and has been fantastic at it. So I'm really excited to see what Daryl and I can do on the full schedule this year. And my good friend, still great friend, and former partner Mark Sanchez is with Adam Amin, and I know they'll have a great season too.
All right, great stuff. For everybody, be sure to check out Husker247.com. We have plenty of coverage from a UTEP game, and we will have a mountain of coverage for the Colorado game. I anticipate I will be quite busy with recruiting updates throughout the week and everything else leading into what feels like a really, really, really large and fun opportunity non-conference game for Nebraska here. So be sure to check that out at Husker247.com. For Kevin Kugler, I'm Mike Schaefer. Appreciate your time this morning. We'll catch you next time with the Sunday Side Session.